How often have you read a post asking, how can I achieve a cinematic image? Most answers are usually that it's all about the lighting. Lighting is certainly very important, but what are the other ingredients in the magic sauce? I have never seen an attempt to capture and answer the subject as a whole and to provide something like a recipe that might serve as a kind of shortcut to a much improved result. And that's why we set out to create a form of compendium that tries to do just that. See it as a very condensed curriculum of what a film school should teach these days. This will include evaluating gear as well as expertise and some tips and tricks. Watch the screen, Miss Darling.
If you are here, you're probably someone who sat in a cinema at some point and thought, I want that. I want to create those stories and these images that are so familiar, yet so poetic and powerful, just magical in their very own way. Every image from the silver screen that burned into your mind poses the question, what is the magic sauce that makes them so cinematic? Are there secrets? And of course, how can I create those cinematic images myself? And where's the darn button? Depending on where you are in your journey, you might feel that what you get out of your camera is not, well, cinematic in the way you saw it on the silver screen. But why? Sure, you don't have those fantastic actors, sets, costumes, lighting and so on, but there's a ton of examples in the history of film that show relatively mundane things that still look cinematic. Is it really all about what happens in front of the camera, or is it what happens behind the camera? Is it where the camera is placed or how it is moved, and how important is the camera itself? Is it more about the lenses, the dynamic range, maybe about the codecs, color science, the grade, or some post-production magic? We are setting out to quantify the different elements of the magic sauce and provide something like a recipe or even a shortcut for those who are on the journey themselves. We are going to evaluate all the ingredients with examples and experiments. Did we arrive at a point where the camera is neglectable? We are going deeper into technical qualities like resolution, dynamic range, and of course we are going into the relevance of lenses. We are going to pitch kit lenses against vintage and Cine Lenses. Can you tell the difference? Or is the lens choice largely irrelevant to a cinematic image? This episode is kindly sponsored by Dehancer, and we will go into the post-process and how Dehancer can help you to create cinematic images, way beyond turning the colors to look like film stock. Let's start by meeting your lector for all things cinematic with our spoof, Breaking the Silence. Don't go near the glass.
Hi, I'm Barney. He told you don't get near the glass. If you want to know how to create a cinematic image, he is a good lector. But whatever you do, don't use the term cinematic lightly. He's past the others in cell 667, the neighbor of the beast, you know.
Dr. Lecter, my name is Clarice Starling. May I speak with you?
You're into filmmaking, aren't you?
I am, yes.
A student seeking to create a cinematic image?
Yes, I'm a student. I'm here to learn from you.
Sit, please. Now then, what does cinematic mean?
Perhaps you'd care to lend us your view.
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Cinematic describes something as having the aesthetics of a film, and isn't that a complete circular reference?
I'm only asking you to look at this, Doctor. Either you will or you won't.
A director once asked me to make an image more cinematic. I ate his liver with some fava beans and nice Chianti. Let's try to deconstruct the meaning of cinematic, little starling. Fly, fly, fly. Fly, fly, fly.
This spoof was filmed in my living room, and it fits so well to the original thanks to the help of the Dehancer film emulation plugin, and there's a tutorial in the post section of this episode. So stick around if you would like to create something like this yourself. Our Lynch and Kubrick members will also get some project files for Resolve and After Effects, as well as some footage to play with in their action packs. The word cinematic describes very little but a feeling. Fashion and technology has changed so much over a century of filmmaking that it's wild to still see a connecting quality in the images. Modern and old, analog and digital, black and white and color, a highly stylized fantasy world, or the gritty reality of your backyard.
We should do this again sometime.
Even beyond cinema, the term cinematic maintains its validity. Who would dare to describe Game of Thrones, Westworld or Chernobyl with anything else but cinematic? Music videos and high-end advertising always had a cinematic approach, even inspiring the fashion of cinema. Many fantastic filmmakers like Ridley Scott, David Fincher, Jonathan Glazer and Tarzan coming from that realm.
Maybe they're friendly.
There's a thin thread that connects them all. A cinematic image is an image that is subjective rather than objective. It is somebody else's vision, and it has taken the shape and qualities of that person's imagination. You could say it is reality that has been pre-digested, or fermented if that sounds better to you. We distill that in the following mantra and use that on almost anything we shoot. A cinematic image is a visualized memory. It shouldn't be objective in every way. A cinematic image is beautiful even if it shows us terrible or ugly things, because it is crafted to be what it is. It is art.
What's this?
A film is made 3 times. First in the writing of the script, once again in the shooting, and finally in the editing. This quote by Robert Bresson encapsulates the process very well. Talking to filmmakers, you often hear that it's all about the story, which is true of course. But paper and pen will do so then, right? In a cinematic context, there is obviously more to it. Cinema is visual storytelling. For this episode, we will put the story out of the picture. This will include the edit, which is just as and arguably more important than the filming itself for telling the story. While we are talking about the image here, you should always remember that at the heart of it, cinema is storytelling, and the image should tell the story.
The most important part of a cinematic image is you. When we say behind the camera, we are talking about the filmmaker or the crew in a larger context. The most important part of everything is always the filmmakers. For our context, we will mean you when we talk about the filmmaker and what happens behind the camera.
It makes a lot of sense to look at simple things that can ruin a cinematic image. Not only to avoid those, but also to help us figure out what makes an image more cinematic. So let's get those out of the way before we go into more sophisticated things.
This is the first film ever shot. It is not shot on a film camera, but with 16 photo cameras that were triggered when the horse passed by. Since an early time in cinema's history, the standard frame rate in cinema is 24 frames per second. If we play the 16 images at 24 frames per second, it looks a bit choppy. This is not because there are too few frames. This is how the film looks if we play the 16 images at 12 frames per second and it doesn't look fluent. This is how it looks when we interpolate frames to 24 frames again, creating a slow motion. What is missing is the motion blur. We added motion blur in post. When filming, every frame should be exposed at half the time of the frame's duration. This will create the most natural-looking illusion of movement by blurring objects depending on their speed. This is called a 180-degree shutter. Of course, one can have a smoother, sharper and more realistic motion by increasing the frame rate. In this day and age, this is not a technical issue. Most cameras allow you to shoot double or more frames per second, but should you? There seems to be more to motion blur and frame rate than meets the eye. There have been experiments with higher frame rates again and again over the history of cinema. In the digital age, filmmaker Ang Lee, who is famous for iconic movies like Life of Pi, experimented with high frame rate movies. Gemini Man and Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk both use 120 frames per second during capture as well as during projection. And while you might think, this doesn't look bad right here, it's a perfect example for the importance of frame rate. This is the scene at 24 frames per second, and the link in the corner will get you a version with 60 frames per second. If you compare the two, it demonstrates the problem. While there is nothing wrong with all the other factors that make an image cinematic, like acting, lighting, blocking, you name it, there is something wrong. The 60 frames per second version makes it real, arguably too real. An aesthetic we are used to and therefore associate with broadcast programs. While I totally get Lee's approach to give Billy Lynn's weight by making it real, these high frame rate experiments didn't find much love in the audience. When we talk about avoiding high frame rates, we clearly speak about how a film is displayed in a cinematic context. High frame rates are very valid for acquisition of slow motion footage or sports and broadcast. It speaks for the validity of 24 frames per second that it's not based on technical limitations these days, and there's more to it than just the viewing habits we mentioned. It seems to be a sweet spot that leaves our brains enough room to interpret the image as something like a memory. The combination of 24 frames per second with a 180-degree shutter is the classic look. 25 frames per second or 30 frames per second will not look vastly different. Many of us will remember watching 24 frames per second movies on an NTSC TV interlaced, using a pull-down, looking quite cinematic. When modern TVs interpolate 24 frames per second to display high frame rate, it ruins the cinematic look. Everything looks like a cheap video.
The importance to the cinematic image is very high. The further we strive from 24 frames per second, we venture out of the cinematic sweet spot. If your camera can do 24 frames per second and it doesn't interfere with your lights or monitors, use it. You can use the shutter angle to compensate monitor flickers and the likes. Stay as close to the 180-degree shutter rule as possible, unless you have a very good reason not to. You read it 100 times on the usual platforms. Is this or that lens sharp? Does it stay sharp wide open, or is it sharp edge to edge? I love to shoot wide open because I like it soft.
Almost everything you ever saw in cinema is not really that sharp. This has a lot to do with technical limitations of the process, but even in modern cinema with digital acquisition and 4K projection, a cinematic image is in focus, but it's not overly sharp because it would break the magic of making it too real. Many of your favorite movies were shot on an ARRI Alexa in ProRes, meaning that the digital negative was 2.8K at best, and the master is usually 2K.
Importance to the cinematic image? High. In the sense that there shouldn't be too much perceived resolution. Always switch off sharpness enhancing in camera and Don't sharpen footage in post unless you really have a good reason to do so. There is nothing wrong with upscaling as long as your chosen process doesn't add details or sharpens edges. Consider to reduce detail and resolution by filtration, by using vintage, anamorphic or detuned lenses. You can also reduce perceived detail in post without making the image look too soft. We will show you later how. Resolution and distribution is a completely different thing, but not so much because of the resolution itself. Virtually all media and video platforms like Netflix and YouTube allocate more bandwidth to higher resolution video. Rather than the amount of pixel, the higher bandwidth is what makes the image quality better. Upscaling to a higher resolution can make a lot of sense in that context. Now that we got some basic no-nos out of the way, let's get more into the heart of the subject. Let's start with what seems to be a super important ingredient: the gear, camera, lenses, and all the tools to put these into the right position and movements. The fun stuff.
Until the rise of digital acquisition in cinema, cameras were more about the practical aspects than about the image. The image itself was created by the film stock on its development. There were few suppliers of stock, Kodak Eastman being the major player, and stock choices were usually limited to color balance and various sensitivities. The chemistry of film got better and better over the decades, meaning that higher ISO film with less grain was available. 2010's Shutter Island looks very detailed. 1976 Taxi Driver looks considerably softer. Both were shot spherical and have a nice master. It's mostly the chemistry of the film that makes the difference here. As the negative was a limiting factor, lenses were usually as sharp and contrasty as possible and not shot wide open unless necessary to get the right exposure. Of course, there were different film formats and variants with corresponding cameras over the decades, too many to go through here, but we have a pretty decent roundup in our Scope Chapter 1 if you are interested. The dominant format was and is 35mm film in different variants like Academy, Techniscope and Super 35 that simply use more or less surface area of the same substrate. Besides the stock, cinematographers could create their desired look with lighting, exposure, use of different lenses and filtration, and different color timings or processing during development. Film stock is said to offer a dynamic range of about 14 stops, depending on the specific chemistry, and that is a lot. More than most digital cameras offer even today. Highlights clip late and the roll-off looks beautiful. On the other hand, sensitivity is bad by digital standards and underexposures quickly takes a toll. Super 35 is often stated as having a resolution of about 4K, but that is largely dependent on the stock and generation. 4K scans are more about preserving the grain structure that is important to the perceived resolution. The resolution that modern sensors deliver exceeds the theoretical resolution of a camera negative, and the image is not further degraded in a cine process requiring many generations from negative to screen. A digital 2K image was arguably enough resolution to preserve the details Super 35 can muster, which is why it was the preferred resolution of a master in the digital intermediate process. Analog TV cameras and camcorders had much smaller formats and dynamic range, resulting in a very different look. Emulating the look of 35mm film was a sporty endeavor for filmmakers, including things like depth of field adapters and lighting very carefully to stay within the dynamic range of the camcorders. This brings us to the digital revolution in cinema. Or is it an evolution? I suppose it's both. Here are some important steps in the history of digital cinema cameras. The first cameras that were used in cinema and that were not video cameras designed for broadcast were Sony Cine Alta cameras that had the same small 3CCD technology used in camcorders, requiring special lenses developed for the format. 2002 Star Wars Attack of the Clones was pioneering here. The Cine Altas had very limited dynamic range and details, but the practical advantage to see what the camera was actually shooting and to review takes without having to wait for dailies was undeniable from the get-go. 2002 brought the Thomson Viper camera that also used 3 to 3/3 inch sensors. This camera was David Fincher's digital gateway drug, and he shot Zodiac and some scenes of The Curious Case of Benjamin Button on the Viper.
This is some sleazy plan to get me to go home with you.
2003, the first cinema camera with a single CCD, the Dalsa Origin, was released. A sensor size similar to 35mm film allowed the use of regular Cine Lenses. It was very expensive and didn't score major credits in cinema except for some effect scenes in James Bond: Quantum Solace. In 2005, the Panavision Genesis took the crown of the digital cinecams. Ironically, it didn't let the crew review the shot material, taking away one of the major advantages of digital productions. According to Fincher, that was the reason why he didn't use the Genesis for Zodiac. The Genesis was rebranded and updated to the Sony f/35 in 2008. Also in 2005, ARRI introduced their first shot at digital cinema with the D20. It only has a few credits, but among them is Guy Ritchie's first digital film, 2008's Rock'n'Roller. 2007 was the year that Red introduced the Red 1. The relatively low price compared to cameras like the Genesis made digital cinema accessible for mainstream. And while it didn't score blockbusters, probably due to reliability issues, it forced the industry to move. 2008 brought the Silicon Imaging SI2K, a 60mm sensor digital cinecam with a detachable head. It was used in Slumdog Millionaire to attract less attention, filming guerrilla style through Mumbai's streets. In 2010, ARRI released the Alexa that changed cinema on a larger scale. According to many working DOPs, it was the first camera to exceed the quality of 35mm film, technically speaking, delivering a dynamic range of more than 14 stops. Melancholia was one of the first credits of the Alexa. The famous slow-motion sequences of the movie were shot digitally too, but on a dedicated high-speed camera, the Vision Research Phantom. Later cameras from Red like the Epic, Dragon, Helium and V-Raptor have their fans among directors and DOPs. Especially Fincher likes Red. He shot all of his films since The Social Network on Red cameras. Still, the cinema mainstream clearly belonged to ARRI and the Alexa. In 2012, the Empire tried to strike back and Sony released the f/65 with little impact. It took 5 more years for them to gain relevant market share with the 2017 release of their full-frame Venice. ARRI entered the 4K full-frame game with the Alexa LF in 2018. Since then, there were evolutionary steps, but no big revolutions that changed the market significantly. Except maybe a revived interest in analog formats like 70mm and IMAX, mostly thanks to Christopher Nolan and Hoyte van Hoytema. Meanwhile, the high-end cine cameras got new competitors from the lower-end market and mirrorless cameras. The sensor market collapsed to only a few major players left in the competition, with a clear dominance of Sony that supplies sensors for the majority of camera manufacturers. From the entry-level full-frame camera up to high-end cinema cameras, the sensors are surprisingly similar in design and capability. Mostly via CMOS technology, delivering very similar dynamic range and sensitivity. It is amazing how indistinguishable the images tend to be at first glance and in the final result. Advances seem to be so incremental that even a decade-old cinema camera can hold up to modern ones.
There are a ton of subjects that are interesting in the camera section. Rolling shutter versus global shutter, readout speeds, you name it, not to mention practical aspects that can easily outweigh pure image quality. But we want to stay focused on the cinematic qualities of an image. So we will talk about aspects that are most relevant to that. While it's not necessarily important, but we know this will come up. Let's start with the sensor size, or better, the format in general.
You often hear the notion of a large format look. To be clear straight away, no format has a specific look. A large format doesn't inherently look different to a smaller one, as long as equivalent lenses are used. Of course, it is simpler to produce a shallow depth of field with a large format or a deep depth of field with a smaller one in the very extreme ends of the spectrum, but in a cinematic context that hardly ever matters unless you go really big or small. With analog formats, a larger negative was and is used to reduce the grain size and increase the resolution in larger projections. IMAX requires a 9 times larger negative than 35mm because it is designed to fill the peripheral view of the audience for a more immersive experience. If you frame IMAX like a normal film, you are much too close to the subject, giving you a first-row cinema experience. You could argue that Christopher Nolan uses large formats up to IMAX because only a very large negative will deliver a comparable quality to smaller digital sensors. Besides, it's a good story to use IMAX, and Nolan is a lot about marketing. Success proves him right. Digital formats are different as they are not restricted by chemistry. A smaller sensor can potentially outperform a larger one given the used technology. Sensors are bound by physics though. For example, a smaller format cannot increase the resolution without running into diffraction at a lower and lower f number. This is why a tiny sensor will never have a higher resolution image compared to a large format, unless the image is computized, of course. Sensor sizes are very much about fitting the lenses one desires to use. For our use case in a cinematic context, the sensor size is largely neglectable. Danny Boyle's upcoming 28 Years Later shows how good an iPhone 15 can look. That is, if you pull every trick in the book, like using large Cine Lenses. Hardly practical. While being 15 years old, Alexa's Super 35 sensor still creates the better images. The importance to the cinematic image is low. Red has been pushing the importance of resolution from the start of the digital revolution. Filmmakers like David Fincher's love to crop and reframe in post to support their style of filmmaking. And it makes a lot of sense in that context to start with a sensor that has a high resolution. ARRI, on the other hand, followed another route. The Aleph 3 sensor has a resolution of only 3.4K, and it only has that when shooting in open gate modes, which is rarely done. Most things that you have seen and loved is shot in 2.8K sensor crop with a 2K master, and it looks great. Some later productions squeezed out every bit of quality out of the Aleph 3 by shooting in 3.4K and mastering in 4K. Looking at what the old ARRI Alexa can do, it's very hard to argue for missing resolution, at least in the context of the final delivery. The Revenant mixed images shot in different resolutions combined in a 4K master. The Alexa 65 uses 3 fused Aleph 3 for 6.5K. The Alexa XT and XTM use 1 Aleph 3 with 3.4K. What you see here is a big resolution difference in the source material. It speaks volumes that you can't identify which is which by just looking at the shots, even in the best viewing conditions. Our The Killer Masterclass was shot in 3.4K on the Alexa, while the original is a crop of an 8K Red V-Raptor. The crop is probably around 6K. Does 4 times the amount of pixels show? The high-end sector cared little about resolution until Netflix put their foot down and demanded real 4K acquisition for their own productions. Unless your family name is Cohen, of course. 2018's Netflix movie The Ballad of Buster Scruggs was shot on the Alexa in 2.8K and mastered in 2K. Still, ARRI kind of gave in to the market's pressure and released the Alexa LF in 2018. 2 fused Aleph 3 sensors providing 4.5K resolution using the same proven colors, codecs and workflow. For a narrative context that doesn't require the ability to punch into the image a lot, resolutions beyond 4K make little sense. Of course, and as always, the technology behind the sensor has a lot of impact, and there's nothing wrong with high resolution on modern hybrid cameras.
A little slow tonight, isn't it?
One of the specs that is very often stated as the most important ability of a digital camera is the dynamic range.
What do we get?
This means the difference between the brightest part of an image before the image clips and the darkest part of the image before information disappears in the noise floor. The difference in between values is measured in stops of light, so doubling or halving the amount of light from one stop to the next. The Thomson Viper used in Zodiac had a dynamic range of about 10 stops. That is bad performance by today's standards, but as you see, it looks great. These scenes from 2014's It Follows have a similar lighting mood and are shot on an Arri Alexa that has over 14 stops dynamic range. While the image looks more detailed, the huge difference in dynamic range isn't that obvious. Here's something in the same mood that we shot on a Marvo LF that has 12 stops. This proves that dynamic range is a lot about the content of a scene and you don't need great values to create a cinematic image. Still, a higher dynamic range can make highlights roll off better, so transition into the midtones in a visibly softer way, if exposed right. A larger dynamic range allows to capture images that have more natural difference in brightness, like with windows in a dark room, without having to ND the windows or light against the sun. A better dynamic range can also make exposure much simpler, as there's headroom to change the exposure in post or to create high dynamic range or short HDR content. Looking at an image straight out of the camera, the dynamic range is often one of the first noticeable differences between cameras. The most sophisticated technical trick to improve the dynamic range is to use dual gain output, or short DGO sensors. The sensor records two images with different gains at the same time. These images are combined in the camera and, presto, we have the extended dynamic range of a darker and a brighter image in one. DGO sensors are found, for example, in the Arri Alexa cameras, the Ursa 4.6K and some Canon Cine cameras. They are more expensive to develop and produce, they need more power to work and better cooling. For most applications, including cinema, normal sensors are good enough, and even cameras like the Sony Venice don't have DGO sensors. Cameras from all classes, including hybrid cameras, are surprisingly close in terms of dynamic range. There haven't been huge jumps in what dynamic range sensors deliver in quite a while, with the exception of the Alexa 35. That is what happens when a modern sensor is combined with DGO. As dynamic range is such a sought-after spec and there are different methods of measuring dynamic range, manufacturers can be kind of spin doctors. It is great to have a resource that measures dynamic range and latitude with the same process. This will provide numbers that make cameras comparable. Cine has a very good lab test section on their website comparing most important cameras in the field, from consumer cameras up to the higher end.
They were so kind to allow me to use their results for this episode. Thank you so much, Cine. There's a link to their lab test with way more details and interesting discussions in the description. If you don't know it, check it out.
The importance to the cinematic image is medium. Keep in mind that the dynamic range is not everything. Some amazing shots have been created using older cinema cameras with limited dynamic range, and even modern high-speed cameras like the Phantom only sport around 10 stops dynamic range. We shot a new logo animation with a Phantom, and even with the difficult lighting you get from fire, 10 stops are very workable. There are many other technical aspects that make for a great image, or a bad one. Colors and latitude, sensitivity and noise, codecs, log, raw, color sampling, bit depth, but we decided to keep such very technical details out of this episode. For a little cookbook, here's a very condensed practical advice. Use the best codecs that the camera you are using is offering and a log profile with at least 10-bit or RAW. This will provide you with a digital negative that leaves enough headroom to create powerful looks in post. Only shoot fully manual. Your camera doesn't know what looks good and what is important in a given context. Learn how your camera behaves over and underexposed. Expose according to the desired look and camera. We try to keep things like resolution, color sampling and bit depth as high as possible until the final delivery. This way, your archive allows to reuse content for a prolonged time.
Even with different formats, variations, technologies and specs, sensors have moved very close to each other in terms of image quality. We reached a point of sophistication where it's fair to ask, does the camera even matter anymore? Should I, as a filmmaker, invest in expensive cameras, or is there a more effective way to get to a cinematic image? As usual, there's no short answer to that, and practical aspects are as valid as they were since the dawn of cinema, which can go both ways as size, weight, codec, and many other aspects strongly influence the whole workflow and infrastructure.
To test the subject, we prepared a shootout using 3 very different cameras. But before we go there, we have to talk about lenses first, as they are such an important ingredient in our magic sauce and an integral part to our test.
Cine lenses are important for filmmaking, but how important are they for a cinematic image? Should you invest in Cine lenses? Are vintage photo lenses a good alternative, or can you even use the kit lens that came with your camera?
That doesn't interest me, Doctor. Frankly, it's...
I can see that that idea is upsetting you. In our shootout, we will put that to the test from a purely optical perspective. Talking about the character of lenses is a lot like talking about wine. It is very subjective and often depends on circumstances that have little to do with the lens itself. Competing manufacturers try to strengthen their profile with colorful language. Claims like lenses that make the whole world cinematic are marketing with little substance. Cine lenses provide practical and technical advantages, and I will not deny that certain lenses have certain looks, but that is mostly subtle, and it's safe to say that no lens delivers a cinematic look, besides some anamorphic lenses, and only in a narrow way. Historically, the choice to shoot on Panavision, Zeiss, Cooke or Origineux lenses had little to do with the look and a lot to do with where you shoot a movie. Cine lenses are optically not necessarily better or even different than photo lenses.
Cine lenses have been specifically designed for cine productions and their requirements. In a nutshell, this means that they are fully mechanical and have hard stops. They have gearing on focus, iris and zoom for motorization and the use of follow focus systems. Focus throw is usually much longer than on a photo lens, especially modern autofocus lenses that have short throws so the servo motors can focus quicker. There are more traits of Cine lenses that are not always giving depending on the specific Cine lens. Usually, Cine lenses have unified positions of the gears and the same front sizes for quicker lens changes. Internal focus so the lenses don't change their length, which is bad for matte boxes, and many Cine lenses are corrected for breathing, so the lenses doesn't have the subtle focal length changes that comes with pulling the focus. Traditionally, Cine lenses are built sturdy to survive the rental gear requirements and to allow easier servicing. Cine lenses would have the sturdy long flange mount systems of the cameras of their time, and maybe most importantly, they are collimated and shimmed to have precise markings. This was so important because the focus puller wouldn't see the image that an analog camera films. The cameraman himself would look through the optical viewfinder for framing, but not the focus puller. Even later film cameras that used video systems in the viewfinder wouldn't deliver an image good enough for critical focus. Focus pullers use tapes and markings to hit the right focus distance without visual confirmation, which is hard to do and requires a lot of experience. This explains why so many old and even relatively modern movies have scenes that are obviously out of focus, sometimes because of the subject is moving, and sometimes, well, shit happens. If the distance markings on the lens were off, so would be the focus. Only precise shimming on the lenses as well as on the camera mounts would allow for reliable focus pulling. You can imagine that using normal photo lenses would be futile in those times. Digital cine cameras changed that a lot. Today, focus pullers usually work visually by using monitors, focus assist features and tools like Cinetape. This makes correct markings less critical, but a good Cine lens will still be precisely shimmed. When we change the mount on the camera or the lens, use adapters etc., that quickly goes down the drain. You just don't really notice it when pulling focus using your monitor and peaking. This is why Cine mounts and lenses come with shims, but it requires experience and tools to adjust the back focus precisely. Autofocus systems like PDAF use the image of the sensor to determine the focus distance, so correct markings are less important. Today, most new Cine lenses are designed for full-frame cameras, and there's a trend to lighter designs optimized for shorter flange systems like E, RF or L. For filmmakers today, the relevance of Cine lenses is primarily about the practical aspects. Pulling focus on a shot, especially when performed by the cameraman himself, is much easier with the right Cine lens and a follow focus. Only this will allow to guide the eyes of the audience to what matters. No autofocus can know the story, the relevance and the mood of what you are filming. Of course you can attach focus gears to your autofocus lenses, but it is cumbersome and the missing hard stops don't allow you to develop a muscle memory to where the focus distance is at what hand position. Vintage photo lenses are manual with hard stops and work much better with added focus gears. Besides their interesting look, this is what makes them a popular budget option for filmmakers. Most modern lenses are designed to be as contrasty, bright, sharp and clear as possible, and there's nothing wrong with that. We call that a transparent lens as it doesn't add anything to the image. As digital images tend to look a little sterile, vintage and anamorphic lenses had a revival. These lenses can introduce characteristics and flaws like optical aberrations, interesting flares, highlights blooming and sharpness fall-off, lending the image a poetic note. We produced episodes about two legendary vintage lens families. The contact size versus the size super speeds following The Shining. And the Canon FD versus the K35 following Aliens. Check out those if you want to know more.
Mark.
Anamorphic is a whole world to explore, and we have our Scope series following Blade Runner, exploring the history, technology and fashion of widescreen cinema. We also have several episodes testing modern anamorphic Cine lenses. Check out our masterclass episode where we recreate David Fincher's The Killer using anamorphic Cine lenses. If you are interested in the art of rehousing a photo lens to a Cine lens, we have the rehousing episode that gives you a ton of interesting insights, including how to evaluate the quality of a lens and how to judge defects.
Importance to the cinematic image, medium. For a filmmaker, it makes a lot of sense to play with all kinds of lenses to get a feel what works best given the story he wants to tell. It may make sense to look into a filtration to add a certain vibe to the image. While you can add very personal note with a lens choice, you can create a cinematic image with any lens. Embracing the look of a lens is more important to you and maybe to other filmmakers than it is to a general audience. Having said that, practical aspects are very important to streamline a workflow or just to improve storytelling with a much better focus precision. And if you have been on this channel, boy, we are suckers to fast glass.
The first contender on our shootout is the heavyweight of digital cinemas, the legendary RF3 sensor inside the Alexa XT-M. Heavyweight is quite literal as the full-size Alexas are huge and heavy, but the M version of this camera has a detachable head that needs to be tethered with a fiber cable to a full-size body. XT stands for Extended Technology, which was RS denomination for the second generation of Alexa Classic cameras featuring onboard RAW recording with high-speed XR cards and open gate modes, allowing to record 3.4K instead of the first-gen limitation to 2.8K. The camera was originally intended for 3D rigs, but also used for action shots, helicopter gimbals and whenever lightweight cameras came in handy. It has the exact same image quality that the normal ARRI Alexa XT delivers, so you can look to all those gorgeous productions like Blade Runner 2049 to see what this camera can do. The Revenant utilized the Alexa XT-M a lot to be able to get the up-and-close handheld shots that you see throughout the movie. Shots that would be hard or even impossible to pull off with a full-size XT. As the Alexa 65 can't be overcranked, the Alexa XT or XT-M were also used for the slow motions. The XT-M was also used for many scenes in Mad Max Fury Road, where it helped to catch some of the very dynamic shots in the battles and in confined spaces. Roger Deakins used it in Skyfall for some shots, for example the escalator scene. There are a few cooler than Roger as this BTS shows, and there's the M in his skillful hands. For us, the M is such an ideal camera as we didn't have to invest in our gear. Our light tripods, sliders and even gimbals are strong enough to carry the head. Try that with a full-size Alexa. The camera has exactly 2 buttons, one to power the head up and down and one to run and stop recording. And that is actually kind of liberating. It reduces your process to what it should be, as manual as it gets. A bit of rigging makes the head almost as practical as the Alexa mini camera, and it has some advantages. It can record open-gate, uncompressed RAW up to 75 frames per second, unlike the Mini's 30 frames per second. Most AMs have been used on helicopters, like ours was. That means very low operating hours. Our came in with 500 hours, which is nothing to the Mini's usual 5 to 20k hours in rental use. We added the DJI Focus Pro to give the head autofocus capability, which is really just awesome.
If you are thinking practical, this is not it. This camera is like a classic car, and as such you will have oily hands, if you know what I mean. But boy, if you drive it, it's something. If you ever wanted to be an Alexa owner-operator, this is a very affordable way to become one, and the low use price around $6,000 makes the Alexa the highest end but medium priced option in our Shootout.
Our second contender is the Kinefinity Mavo LF Mark II, the second generation of Kinefinity's Mavo full-frame Cinecam. The Mavo is and has been the camera that we use the most on this channel. And boy did it have to take a beating, including removing the sensor for our f0.7 project and many other things that are quite dangerous. It is to the credit of the Mavo LF that it has never failed us, even under those circumstances. The image quality is very good and the 6K dual ISO delivers amazing sensitivity. Using back illuminated Sony sensors, it can easily deal with 10,000 ISO. A very practical sub-mount system makes the camera super flexible when it comes to lenses. Using NVMe media, internal ProRes up to 4444XQ at about any format you can think of, all discrete options, a strong OLPF, SDI timecode, Genlock and much more, the Mavo LF Mark II is a real cine workhorse, perfect for production like ours. B&H lists the Mavo LF Mark II body at $9,000. Our third contender is the Panasonic Lumix S5 IIX, a classic mirrorless hybrid photo and video camera. It is the entry-level full-frame option in the Lumix lineup, and the X indicates some advanced features like ProRes 422 to an external SSD and in-cam streaming capabilities. It comes with an L-mount that is very versatile. Unlike other big players in the market, Panasonic has a great track record for making their cameras very capable for filmmaking. It has a very good PDAF autofocus and an amazing 3-axis in-body stabilization. Dual ISO, anamorphic modes, V-Log, full-size HDMI out. Unlike the FX3, it can record video in open gate mode, meaning that you can get all of the 6K glory internally in H.265 420 on 2 SD cards for continuous filming or mirrored for safety. It doesn't have an OLPF, so it's very sharp. Great for raw photography, not so great for filmmaking. Still, if we need something that basically shoots by itself, especially on things like gimbals, our S5 IIX is our go-to camera at the moment. For single shooters and out of the box, it is the most affordable and practical system in our Shootout. The image is great for a camera in the class, and it will be interesting to see if it can compete with the over 4 times more expensive Mavo or even the Alexa. A camera is nothing without a lens. In our mix of setups, we have modern Cine Lenses with the DZO Arliss, vintage photo lenses with the Canon FD and contact size, anamorphic lenses with the DZO Pavo, and somewhere in between all these there's the most uncinematic lens you can think of, a kit zoom lens. We purposely chose to shoot something relatively mundane as we don't want to distract from what this comparison is about. I simply walk through the studio in different lighting situations and temperatures, from side light to backlight to top light. We shoot the same scene over and over, but with different cameras and lenses tossed up. The rules of the Shootout are as follows. We are shooting all cameras with the best internal codec available to the system, that is H.265 for the Lumix, ProRes 4444XQ on the Mavo, and uncompressed RE-RAW on the Alexa. We match the colors in post as far as that is possible. While you can take the sporty and try to guess which camera with what lens is used, our intention is simply for you to decide for yourself which shot looks more or less cinematic, or if there is any such distinction at all. The shots are numbered and you will find camera and lens combination for the fitting shot number in the description.
Hanging around after last orders, but still so far from home. It's like we're burning into embers, just a fire burns a cold world. As the days keep rolling on, we're living in hell again. But I still hold you in my heart when these days have been and gone. Ooh, 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 ooh. Always ending up the same. Crescent moons have all gone home. We're all fired up, we're tangled up, we're enmeshed to the point and messed up. As the days keep rolling on, we're living in hell again. I still hold you in my arms when these days have been and gone. Ooh, 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 ooh. Ooh, 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 ooh. As time goes by, we keep heading on, circles never letting go, never letting go. As time goes by, we keep heading on, circles never letting go, never letting go. Round in circles, never letting go, never letting go.
Did you get different cinematic vibes from the images? And if yes, how much of that was from the camera, from the grade, and how much of that was from the lens choice? Let us know and discuss in the comments. We will finish up with a side-by-side comparison of the Lumix S5 IIX with the kit zoom next to the Arri Alexa with the DZO Arliss. And if you can immediately say which is which on a larger display, the much higher investment in the Alexa is worth it for you. And if you can't, this should be an encouragement for you.
The importance to the cinematic image is medium. While there's a clear advantage when using higher-end camera, sensors and codecs, the impact on the cinematic quality of an image is little. Every modern camera is more or less capable of capturing a cinematic image. We still voted the importance in medium because a decent camera will clearly impact the filmmaking process. This will include things like that Alexa footage is easier to grade. To be very clear, there are many reasons to use cinecams beyond the image quality. They are built to fit the workflows and the workload of a professional shooting. Also, it really helps if the DOP and the crew really is familiar with the camera and knows how far they can push it. And if something goes wrong, there's usually a cine rental with a replacement camera close by. For independent filmmakers, these things might not be that important. If you want a cinematic result, the camera is not what holds you back. It is very obvious that what happens in front of the camera is essential to a cinematic image, more than the camera or the lens for sure. This will include the location or set, the actors, the costumes, the makeup, the lighting, and even the sound design and score, as that is what tunes you into the feel of the image. This doesn't mean that you need to build a set and with a truckload of lights and a large crew, but filming something with your partner in your living room or backyard will always look kind of mundane, at least to you. So we would avoid that. Let's start with simple things every beginner can do and scale up from there.
27 Apple, take one.
Action.
Oh, Monty. Come, join me on the divan. Why the pout?
Halt! Well, that it were so simple.
Cut. Very good.
A charismatic face and captivating performance can be at least as important to a cinematic image as everything else. Actors allow the audience to connect to the image on an emotional level. As a filmmaker, choosing and communicating with your actors can be challenging. I think there are as many approaches, needs and styles as there are directors and actors. Both can be difficult and there is no luck of horror stories. But that doesn't necessarily ruin a movie. Tensions can be the anvil on which a great performance is forged, and there are many examples for difficult work relationship leading to great movies. A positive, productive collaboration can do the same thing. It is up to the filmmaker to find out who he is and what works best with a given project, actor or situation.
From method acting to the Stanislavski method, there's a whole list of acting techniques.
Talking to me?
From a filmmaker's perspective, there are techniques to get you to the desired performance as well. In American Psycho, Willem Dafoe plays a detective with erratic behavior towards the protagonist. Sometimes he appears to believe he's innocent.
Checked it out. It's clean.
Sometimes he appears to be suspicious.
No. Where were you?
And sometimes he is clearly just playing with his obviously guilty prey. His attitude switches often and seemingly unpredictable from shot to shot. This leaves the protagonist as well as the audience in a very uneasy state. The trick? Director Mary Harron had Dafoe play each scene 3 times, completely immersed in only one belief state, and edited the different behaviors together to one scene. Brilliant. The Kuleshov effect describes a mental phenomenon by which the audience derives meaning more from the context than from the actual acting itself. Alfred Hitchcock was the master of the Kuleshov effect. In Rear Window, Jimmy Stewart's performance was shot without Stewart being aware of what the character would look at in the movie. With the voyeuristic undertones of the situation and clever editing, all that you read into Jimmy Stewart's reaction is conjured up by you, and in the edit of course. The Kuleshov effect allows you to create the performance in the edit. Let's re-edit this to create an emotion. Let's say Jimmy is a vegan.
With that cast on? You don't. Oh, stop sounding stoppy. I can take pictures from a Jeep or a water buffalo if necessary.
Do you see the disgust in his face? It's not really there. In the movie he looks at this. Now his reaction looks very different. Some actors leave the emotional reaction completely to the audience. You can change the narrative from love to hate without any problems. Now, which of both was the original? It was the second one. This is the Kuleshov effect.
Say your line exactly as I'm about to. Just as I'm about to do.
Sure, okay.
So, would that it were so simple.
Would that it were so simple.
Would that it were so simple. Trippingly.
Would that it were so simple.
Why are you doing this?
Would that it were so simple.
Just keep still.
One very interesting technique could be seen as the director's equivalent to method acting. Let's call it method directing. The idea is not to explain to actors how they should perform, but to put them in a state where their performance is real. Here's a simple but great example. When Hans Gruber falls to his death in Die Hard, the impact of the scene has a lot to do with Alan Rickman's performance. He looks genuinely shocked because he actually is. Rickman was dropped from a considerable height into a green screen airbag. The release should have happened after a count to 3.
I'm going to count to 3. 1.
Simple and effective and a bit mean. Famously, Stanley Kubrick shot the staircase scene in The Shining again and again and again and then again and again until Shelley Duvall mentally broke down from exhaustion. So what you see here is not regular acting, but a real person suffering from real abuse. Effective, but really mean. You shouldn't traumatize your actors for art's sake. By the way, Kubrick denied that this was a method act. Method directing can do way more. It can potentially change the meaning of a whole movie by sharing completely different vision with the actors. Here's a theory. Blade Runner is written in a way that Deckard could be a human or a replicant. According to several interviews with director Ridley Scott, Deckard is a replicant. He is put in place by Tyrell and the Blade Runner police force to hunt Nexus 6 replicants that pose too high of a risk for human Blade Runners. All this is experimental, and to assure his allegiance, he doesn't know he's a replicant.
Suspect, how can it not know what it is?
Rachel is an experiment, nothing more.
He doesn't have obvious superhuman abilities, as those would give away his nature to himself. But he is designed to withstand attacks from combat replicants, and he has a very high pain tolerance. Harrison Ford always pushed back against the idea Deckard was a replicant. He is on record saying that Blade Runner would need a human protagonist to connect with the audience. According to Ford, he had discussions with Ridley Scott that ended in an agreement that the character was human. Characters like Bryant and Gaff seem to treat Deckard as a human, but undertones of distrust, lack of respect, and the famous unicorn origami strongly imply that they know he's a replicant.
And if the machine doesn't work?
While being totally aware of his fate in case of a failure.
Right, Deckard, you look almost as bad as that skin jog left on the sidewalk.
It seems to be clear that Deckard is a replicant, or are we just victims of the Kuleshov effect? If you were the director, what would you do to foster all these very authentic performances? If Deckard doesn't know he's a replicant, a good way to strengthen Ford's performance is to make him believe that he actually plays a human. Ridley Scott's discussions with the other actors might have ended in the argument that the character was a replicant. To be clear, I don't know if Ridley Scott did any of this, but it would be a brilliant way of guiding your actors by misguiding them consciously. Sharing alternative visions of your movie can be a powerful tool. Just imagine telling your protagonist that they are the antagonist, and the antagonist that they are the protagonist. We will revisit method directing in the composition and staging chapter.
Good general advice is: have a clear vision. Cast actors that share and enrich your vision. Give the actors space to explore and express their characters. Be well prepared for every scene on your schedule and keep the overarching story and the character development in mind. Feed your actors and the rest of the crew well, and always be the captain of your ship. There can be only one captain and one vision.
The next chapters will not be about fancy studios, sound stages, a ton of space, truckloads of lights, the ability to lock down parts of a city. If you have the budget to build a replica Sistine Chapel or a massive studio that can be digitally extended to look like the Sistine Chapel, and you have the guts to blow the thing up, what are you doing here? This chapter is for the mortals and dreamers, and how to make the best out of basically nothing. As an overarching theme, you should develop a color palette for your film. In movies, this is part of the concept and the pre-production phase, which is then realized by the art direction and the costumes department. Certain colors are placed and others are avoided. Color palettes can and should be represented in the sets, in the costumes, the props, and can be emphasized by lighting as well as in post. Beyond the movie itself, it can be a recognizable hook in things like posters or even merch, just like in this example of the conclave's dominant in almost monochromatic red. Colors can be utilized to enhance storytelling. In Drive, the criminal and violent world of the driver is shown in cold blue and turquoise tones, while Irene's world of love and positivity is held in warm orange and brown tones. When they meet, their color schemes dominate the backgrounds in a metaphorical and literal way. When the driver is absorbed into Irene's world, he takes on her palette. When Irene is pulled into the driver's world, she takes on his palette. The conflict of good and evil is symbolized in the teal and orange palette that extends into the intro, trailers and posters. Palettes can swap within a movie to go with a change in the location, story, timeline. It can do whatever you want. If you have been around this channel, you might have realized that our episodes follow their individual color themes. That is true for their main parts, but extends into the B-rolls, talkies, graphics and behind the scenes. The F0.7 episode has the honey golden palette of candlelight. The Dry for Wet episode, the deep blue of the ocean. The Macro episode has muted and desaturated colors. The F0.3 episode has green and turquoise tint of the forest and the bottom of the lake. This shows that you can utilize palettes even if you don't have complete control over location, sets and costumes. If you think of your next film, think of a color, or maybe two, and let it flow from there. Maybe you have a theme or a location that lends itself to a certain color. In cases like this, let the rest of your production go along with that color theme. A very simple tip for beginners is to go through life with open eyes and an open mind. Look for location and situation that have their own cinematic charm, meaning that they're handsome and not too mundane unless that is part of the story. A staircase, a facade, a back alley, all relatively mundane things that look so cinematic when shot right. If you live in cinematic places like New York or have amazing nature like a desert or a salt lake close by, you are in luck. Chances are that you're not. I feel you. Still, most locations have opportunities that are for you to discover, and even simple locations can look great in the right circumstances. It can be almost anything, just imagine how it would look in context. Just filming against a wall can be very boring, unless there's a wall that has its own graphical quality. Generally, places that have some perspective depth to it work better as they allow for layering your composition. As a filmmaker, you're always also a photographer, and you can start by looking for a great still frame and work from there. Lighting a public space usually means that you have to deal with permits, and powering the light can be difficult too. Ideal are places that have their own interesting lighting, as that will mean that you can work with a light that is already there. Fast lenses in a decent camera can help a lot with that. Good reasons not to shoot with a phone camera. Given the right context, you can even think of some props as a location. Like for a Mindhunter recreation, we used an open reel recorder and a skull, basically as location. Maybe your friends and family has some handsome assets you can use, like houses or special cars, pools with underwater windows, or maybe there's just a nice forest or park not too far away. It is unlikely that there's anything there for a random idea. The trick is to work the other way around. See and recognize cinematic locations or assets that are in your reach. Develop your ideas around the possibilities they give you. Think about what is in your reach and could work for a scene. Build a concept and a story around that, and you're on your way. When choosing a location, you should always think about lighting at the same time. We like the look of the Elbtunnel in Hamburg, again around the corner from us and public. Would it be better without the other people? Sure, you know the gist. The lights on the sides can be used to illuminate your talent. All you have to do is to get in the right position. We'll talk a bit more about that in the chapter Lighting. One thing that is easily forgotten is the sound. If you need to record sound, make sure that your location allows you to do that, as noise is virtually uncontrollable, especially in public places.
Okay.
It's time for a battle of the titans. Today we're going to compare the Canon K35 Cine Lenses versus Canon FD. Costumes and props are an integral part of telling the story. They sell the character to the audience and can make a vast difference on how your film is perceived. They can be a story inside the story.
The Bene Gesserit witch must leave.
Did you know that in the original Dune movie they made the Space Guild suits out of real body bags and didn't tell the actors? We would dare to say that costumes are the most neglected ingredient to a cinematic image in low-budget productions. Good costumes and some great props can make a huge difference for a cinematic image. This doesn't mean that you have to stick your talent in a spacesuit, although you can. You can utilize normal clothes the actor wears every day, but assemble them in a way that doesn't drag your audience out of the story. If you don't have a great idea or specific needs, avoid small patterns is always a good idea, as it can cause more. For Blade Runner and Alien spoofs, we replicated various costumes with very simple things and basic clothing.
Give it a break, Ripley. She doesn't bite hard.
For our Lieutenant Gorman costume, we used an olive overall and stitched on some badge replicas we bought on eBay. Combining that with a vintage headset made it almost complete. But what really sold the character was that I had my hair shaved off. How would you sell being a Marine with long hair? For the Leon character in our Blade Runner spoof, we got a cheap camp suit and again enhanced it by removing the arms and stitching on badge replicas. Getting a racing replica of the Cobb Derringer, also known as Mother's Defender, and to paint it black like the gun featured in the movie sells the character, even when the costume doesn't even attempt to be identical.
Let me tell you about my mother.
Let's start with what anamorphic is all about. What would the Brian character be without a mustache? And how cheesy does a fake mustache look? The simple solution? Grow one. We made a custom stencil to replicate the patterns on Brian's shirt, and we got a holster that looked close to the one in the original.
So you want to shoot anamorphic yourself?
For this episode, it was quite a bit of effort to find an overall that would look close to the prison jumper Hannibal wears in The Silence of the Lambs. We bought a few overalls that all looked nothing like the original on camera, no matter what we did with them. We ended up buying a vintage overall for women, which explains why it's way too short for my 6'2". Thank God that doesn't matter in any of the spoof shots. Washing it with bleach a dozen times gave it the look of being old and worn. We printed the prisoner's number with a letter stencil sheet and textile color. We mention all of this to encourage you to pay attention to details and invest into costumes and props. Small things can make all the difference to sell a character. See if there's a company in your vicinity that rents out authentic costumes. And if there's not, or you have very specific costume needs, get creative. Makeup falls in line with the costume. Again, we're not talking about effect makeup or prosthetics, although it can be absolutely awesome to put that into your production. Sometimes it is simple and effective to just spray some easy-to-mix artificial sweat on your talent to sell the story. If you're not familiar with your makeup, usually the female members of your family, girlfriend or wife can help to choose the right product for the desired effect and knows how to apply it too. Details are important, and you should always include costumes, props and makeup in your thought process. With all your efforts, try to be as authentic as you possibly can, and don't use Halloween costumes and the likes. In cinematography and photography, the artist tries to recreate a three-dimensional world on a flat surface, your screen. Painters developed our eye for contrast, meaning the difference between light and shadows in this context.
Always makes me feel a little melancholy.
The first artist that comes to mind is Rembrandt, in his style of lighting his characters and scenes. This type of lighting is named after him. When Rembrandt was born, another artist, Italian painter Caravaggio, already explored three-dimensional lighting and perspective in extreme and beautiful ways. We can learn a lot from this man's body of work.
The inevitability of time, don't you think?
Lighting is obviously a very complex subject. It can be almost scientific and you can treat it as such. There are many different approaches to lighting: technical, emotional, practical. Film lights are light sources that are explicitly set to illuminate your scene. Lights that are not explicitly supplied by the cinematographer, like sunlight, street lights or lamps in a public building, are referred to as ambient or available light. Light sources that are visible in the frame, usually not film lights, are usually referred to as practical lights, and as far as they illuminate the scenes, they count as available light too. When we think of cinema, we often think of gigantic light setups with powerful sources, and many scenes, old and contemporary, show the fingerprint of gigantic lights, sometimes right out of frame. Like here in Fight Club, or here in Angel Heart, or here in Clockwork Orange. Historically, the use of very bright lights had a lot to do with the low sensitivity of film stock. The cast and crew of The Wizard of Oz was cooked because of the demanding Technicolor process. The actors in the monkey suits of 2001 worked always close to a heat stroke because projectors and lights created a hellish temperature. The costumes didn't help for sure. Maybe that's why they're in a bad mood. With technological advancements like higher sensitivity film and sensors, faster lenses and more power-efficient lights like HMI or later LED, lighting progressively became more and more about aesthetics than technical necessities. That doesn't mean that huge powerful lights disappeared. They are still absolutely necessary for high speed. I'm on such sets a lot, but for general use, these kind of lighting became unfashionable. Unless you shoot on film, of course. Some DOPs swear on a natural look, some go for more dramatic or technical approaches, and there are films that have been shot almost exclusively with natural light. Or practicals. Some scenes are just shot with candlelight, some with Bunsen burners right out of the frame. There's no right or wrong, it depends on the scene, the approach and the budget, of course. Let's get some inspiration from the greatest cinematographers and their different approaches. John Alcott shot many iconic Kubrick movies like Barry Lyndon, The Shining, Clockwork Orange and 2001. After Alcott passed away, Kubrick shot Full Metal Jacket with Douglas Milsome. Milsome is on record saying that Alcott lit like no other cameraman, so effectively with little to no light. Most of his lighting went into one suitcase. I guess that was a very big suitcase for 2001. Still, just like Kubrick's conceptual approach to projects, Alcott's efficiency was very inspiring for me. Milsome and Kubrick shot Full Metal Jacket with practical and available light to support the documentary look, using super speed lenses wide open, and pushing 400 ISO to 800 ISO made it possible. Something that is easily outperformed by affordable digital cameras these days. Roger Deakins is famous for a complex setup with ring lights that can be individually dimmed, like he used excessively in Blade Runner 2049, or his light cove that you find in many of his films, like here in Skyfall. Deakins can surely be efficient too. Still, he seems to have a lot of fun with massive installations, and the results are absolutely beautiful. Hoyte Hoytemar shoots on large format film a lot, and that means he has to use a lot of light. For this scene in Nope, he used a massive crane-based softbox to illuminate the house. Robert Richardson did similar lighting for night exteriors in Django Unchained. It is amazing that it's so obvious and it's still accepted by our mind as real moonlight. Hoytemar used another approach to light the desert for night exteriors. He used the sun. This shot was filmed in daytime with a technique called day for night. There's a lot of post involved in this. Darius Khondji lit the faces in 1991's Delicatessen soft, while lighting the sets hard. For Seven, Khondji created a very different look that is just amazing. Eric Messerschmidt lit the sniper scenes in The Killer almost exclusively with the practical lights that you see in the scenes and some LED panels in front of the windows. We replicated those scenes for a free cinematography masterclass, The Killers, using a more complex setup but with very similar results, showing that you can get similar things with very different approaches. We used Eric's work again for our Mindhunter recreation. The simplicity that is at the heart of this kind of lighting and the small scale lends itself to be recreated, even if you just have your living room and one light to work with. Ridley Scott is a director, of course, but is very much based in cinematography and lighting. His collaboration with Jordan Cronenworth brought us the immortal beauty that is Blade Runner. They approached lighting by switching more and more lights off until they got the one light left that's the only important one. This famous scene from Blade Runner uses one big light from the back. A bounce on the right and haze reflects the lights to fill the shadows. By the way, did you know that Fight Club was shot by Jeff Cronenworth, the son of Jordan Cronenworth, a dynasty of exceptional cinematographers? Of course, one can rely on natural light like Emmanuel Lubezki did for The Revenant. That requires a lot of planning, time, luck, and using a lot of post to get the results you experience on screen. Obviously, there's a lot to learn and that can be intimidating, at least that's how I feel about it. It's almost dangerous to give rules of thumb to work with for people that start out. There are so many different situations and requirements, from beauty to product shots, from gritty street lights to car interiors to stylized approaches. And there are so many techniques and qualities to lighting. Direct, indirect, soft, hard, color schemes. It is a wide field and would deserve many episodes just by themselves, and there are many great resources on YouTube that we encourage you to check out. But let's give you a tiny bit to work from. Start with what emotion a light evokes in you and how that serves the story. How does the light look? What quality does it have? Meaning, is it soft or hard? And from what direction does it come and why? What is the justification for a light? Meaning, is it believable in the context? This is called motivated light. Does the lighting fit the staging and blocking? Will your movement in the scene obstruct the light? You don't need a truckload of lights for a cinematic image. Small mobile lights and even available lights can do magic if you know how to use it. If John Alcott could light out of a suitcase using film, you can, well, learn that too. Try to be efficient. If you rely on available light, you are forced into a spontaneous and quick working style, as natural lights tend to change and ruin your continuity. And it also limits the predictability of a shot's look. Replacing available light with artificial light will add a lot of control and freedom to concentrate on things like acting. Sometimes available light like the street lights and practicals like the headlights of a car and just adding something very small and very mobile can do the trick. If you have a situation like a build set in a studio, playing with light can be just awesome. And lights can be very handsome, not only to illuminate, but as practicals. Create depth and shape with lighting. Backlighting tends to look more cinematic than a flat light from the front. Three-point lighting, like you do in an interview, rarely looks cinematic. Haze can make light visible and create depth in the simplest of setups. Hazes are cheap and simple to use. Don't forget to switch off or remove smoke detectors if you shoot, and don't forget to reinstall them afterwards. If you look at a scene in a movie and you like the lighting, it is not hard to figure out how it was lit. Or at least how to build a tiny setup in your living room or garage that will produce a similar result. All you need to do is to look at the face of your talent, or for lack of alternatives yourself, and the actor in the original scene. What quality and direction has the light? Is it soft or hard? Meaning, does it cast a hard or a soft shadow in what direction? How bright is it relative to the other lights and the ambient light? What color does it have? Put your lights in the same places. If it's a very hard light, use a point light source. If it's a soft light, prefer a light panel and/or add large diffusion. Use grids to direct soft light and prevent spill. Most of the time, you're already there. The eye is easily fooled even with very simple setups.
I think we're gonna need another opinion on that one.
The first time I tried to emulate the lighting of a movie scene, it was for our Shining spoof. No expensive lights, no studio, just what I had, and that should encourage you. And for the first time, I think it came out nicely. Obviously, it gets harder when you have to light a whole scene or group and not just a person in a green screen. That includes having to use much more powerful lights at a larger distance. But the principles remain the same.
Importance to a cinematic image is very high, but that doesn't mean that a lighting setup is very complex or expensive. I think that many of our spoof and recreations over the years prove that. Always keep in mind, light should serve the story that you try to tell. Think about the lighting, but don't overthink it.
Well, what's in it? Describe it.
Oh, okay. So there are two guys.
No. Where's the horizon?
The horizon?
Where is it?
It's at the bottom.
Now remember this. When the horizon's at the bottom, it's interesting. When the horizon's at the top, it's interesting. When the horizon's in the middle, it's boring as shit. Good luck to you. And get the fuck out of my office.
Having all the ingredients to make a film in place, it is time to start cooking your magic sauce. Of course, you would start a film by putting concept and a script together, but as we are only talking about the image, we will leave that out and start with composing the image. Just like with a painting, a composition is everything that is on the canvas of the frame. Composition describes the image in terms of what is in the frame and where. Unlike a painting, a film can change the framing over time. To create a composition, you put your character, props and camera in the desired position. This is called staging. This might be static or it might be dynamic when characters, props or the camera moves. Moving characters is often referred to as blocking, but staging and blocking can also be used synonymously. The composition and staging can be used to give subtext. It can direct attention, imply power relation, show alliances, help with orientation or disorientation, and many other things without a line of dialogue. Staging does not only include the relative position of characters to each other and the stage, but also the position of a character to himself. Simple body language is a form of staging. Staging can extend the set, for example by clever placement of mirrors putting all relevant parts of the story into one frame. Composition can be done very formal and it can be done intuitively. It is the filmmaker's job to tell the story through his composition. To maintain a certain style of composition and staging can work as a trademark for a director, like Wes Anderson's obsession with creating two-dimensional compositions. Staging is not only useful for composition and for subtext, but it can also be a great tool to direct the actors. Well, directly. We have spoken about method directing earlier. This can be a way to apply it. A director can put an actor in a relaxed or in an uncomfortable position by staging. As a result, the actor has less acting to do and behavior is authentic. Practically, this can mean to put the actor in an open space to make him or her feel unsupported and vulnerable, or putting him or her in a comfy chair behind a desk and therefore in a place of power. This authenticity will help the audience to emphasize with the character on a basic level and give the story more impact.
You know, for kids.
The Silence of the Lambs is a great example for this. In the first meeting, Starling is sitting most of the time while Lecter is standing. This gives Lecter a natural dominant position. Unlike bars, the glass disappears in our minds and adds to Starling's vulnerability. Lecter's reflection in the glass sometimes overlaps Starling's face, implying his powerful influence on her. Lecter comes very close to the glass, invading the personal space of the camera and therefore Starling's and the audience's. What you only realize when analyzing the staging, it is that the point of view often switches from a third-person view to a first-person view. Suddenly we, the audience, are Starling and we are the ones who are influenced and threatened. We replicated this effect for the spoof in this episode. When Starling is absent, I look into the camera. When Starling is there, I'll look at her. The close-ups, on the other hand, always look into the camera. You become Starling. This sounds trivial, but it's actually quite difficult to get the eye lines right. It makes sense to give newcomers some inspiration and something formal to work with. A good starting point is to compose an image for aesthetic impact, utilizing design principles such as balance, symmetry, and repetition. If you are a photographer, graphic designer, or painter, this might come very natural to you, but if you're not, these principles are highly formalized. We encourage you to invest time in studying and using these principles and to throw them out of the window too. Anarchy can be a very valid approach. One formal form of staging in a cinematic context is the 180 degrees rule.
It's an imaginary shooting line used to place subjects before the camera. Here, the camera mustn't cross over the line. If it does, then the cut can't be matched up. It's reversed. I'll give you a little demonstration. Watch. See what happens? You're facing the opposite direction.
This is usually used for dialogue with static camera angles. One character always looks to the right and one character always looks to the left. In our minds, the characters look at each other. This is achieved by keeping the camera always on one side of the imaginary 180 degrees line. If the camera moves over that line, the eye line is broken. These people don't look at each other. The camera and characters can cross the imaginary line within a shot as you see that crossing happening. You can also break the rule to intentionally disorientate the audience. The most famous example for this is the bathroom scene in Kubrick's The Shining that we showed in the camera comparison earlier. Here, we switch from one side to the other to make the audience experience Jack's confusion. The sequel, Dr. Sleep, one-ups that effect by not only switching the sides, but also the position of the characters, with the same subcontext. Beyond dialogue, the 180-degree rule can be applied to almost anything to help with spatial orientation. Fraction A shoots to the right, fraction B shoots to the left. These characters are shooting at each other. Even in close-ups, you can instinctively tell which character belongs to which fraction by its orientation. The highest form of staging is to combine a series of shots into one seamless sequence. Steven Spielberg is a master of this technique. His movies often contain sequences that link 4 or 5 different shots, each with their own compositions, into one continuous scene. To pull something like this off is very complex for actors and your crew. Blocking, framing and timing has to be extremely well choreographed to make this work. But if it does, it is fantastic. If you try something like this, always shoot some alternative angles so you retain the option to edit the sequence in post. Generally, a good staging enhances your storytelling, while a bad one confuses your audience unintentionally. How would you compose your image and stage your scene to tell your story? A strong vision will guide your production.
A huge ingredient in the magic sauce is the post. This is where a good image turns into a fantastic image. Shooting digital in a cinematic way does not mean that you have to mimic the look of analog film. It is about finding an aesthetic that works in the context. Still, film emulations are often part of our grades, using and abusing the visual triggers that come with them. With or without typical artifacts like grain, damage, halation and jitter, from a subtle shift in the colors up to emulating a specific stock and process.
As mentioned, we will leave the edit out of the picture and focus on the image itself. We will also leave out the complex CGI that can basically do anything and everything if it's done well. And that's a big if, of course. Compositing can do a lot, like extending your set, putting in layers, combining different shots, or removing unwanted elements. Our episode contains a lot of compositing, and we will get into a tutorial on how we created some of the effects for this episode in a minute. But let's talk about the look of an image first. Movies look different than reality. Just like paint on a canvas, the cinematic process creates a poetic layer between the artist and the audience. Black and white film, Technicolor process, or even modern color film, each process and chemistry had its own look, and none of what you see through the history of cinema resembles what you see in your daily life. This wasn't even intentional, but a side effect. Cinematographers could change how a certain stock looked by filtration, pre-flashing, varicance, and many other techniques, including post-effects like altering the photochemical process and color timing. Imagine Saving Private Ryan without the bleach bypass that desaturated the colors and increased the contrast. Scanning the negative and altering the colors with computers gave filmmakers way more freedom and control over colors while retaining the original character of the film stock. Digital acquisition changed that a lot. While different sensors can be seen like different stocks, this doesn't have as much impact on the image as analog film had. The poetic layer gets thinner. Most cinematic images in the digital age have been processed a lot to look a very specific way. This can be subtle or extreme. We call this process grading. In the professional landscape, this is done by a colorist. This can lead to very unique looking images that have little in common with traditional film stock. Still, there's often a longing for the poetry that analog film has. So let's dial Fury Road's extreme grade back and apply a film emulation in post. You can see this as an anachronism, or you can see it as the power of reality. Just like listening to vinyl records or tapes, it is hard to deny the emotional impact that the analog world has. By the way, this is really analog film from Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome now. If you didn't notice the transition, De Hanser did a great job. Denis Villeneuve's Dune was shot digital on ARRI Alexa LF. The raw footage was printed to film and then scanned back to digital. When you look carefully, you see typical artifacts like gate weaving, meaning that the image jumps a tiny bit between frames, and a very mild film grain. This process seems excessive for something that has such little visible impact. Most productions will use film emulation software like De Hanser. Adding grain is always a very popular choice, and it adds life to digital images. Alien Romulus looks quite clean, but you can see another artifact. Halation, meaning a red-orange halo near the contrasting boundaries of the overexposed areas. Still, shooting film does have its magic, and Dune Part 3 will be shot on newly developed IMAX cameras. If you are an upcoming filmmaker, chances are that you don't have a colorist at hand. So you might have to do the grading, film emulation and compositing yourself. It is a learning curve for sure, but it's also fun. Everything you see on this channel is self-taught, and if I can do it, you can do it. I love the look of the older movies. They look so unique and beautiful. You just want to take any frame from them and hang them on your walls. If you want to copy the look of a movie or even put yourself or others into them, you have to start like with any other movie, by recreating the lighting, sets, costumes, etc. In this tutorial, we don't need the sets because we work with green screen, but you still need the costume and you have to light accordingly. To get the look of the analog film, we use De Hanser. It basically does what they did with Dune, printing and rescanning the film, but in a purely emulated fashion. We love De Hanser and we have used it on about everything we did in the past years, so we speak with quite a bit of experience. De Hanser is a plugin that is available for the major video platforms: DaVinci Resolve, Adobe Premiere and After Effects, and Final Cut Pro. There's also a stills version for Photoshop, Lightroom, Capture One Pro, Affiniate Photo, and there's even a mobile iOS and a browser-based version. For our task, it is great that we can use De Hanser with the same settings and interface inside Resolve and in After Effects. It makes a lot of sense, as you will see. So what does Dehancer do exactly? Well, it's more of a collection of tools than just one tool. Together these tools create a very sophisticated film emulation suite that lets you emulate more than 60 film profiles of different stocks with different inputs from different cameras. Simply choose the camera you shoot on and apply a stock option. Done. You have something specific in mind? You can look up the stock that a film used on IMDb and choose a similar one on Dehancer, or you can just play around until you find something you like. But the colors are just a tiny part of the emulation. You can dial in film grain, halation, bloom, film breathing and damage, gate weaving, overscan and many other things give your footage a unique and analog feel. From a vintage Super 8 look to 70mm glory, Dehancer offers a lot of presets, but you can also customize about everything. While it's simple to use Dehancer, creating the technology and profiles behind the interface is everything but simple. All available stocks have to be shot, scanned, and color matched with 3D color morphing. It is necessary to interpret sample data using nonlinear algorithms to obtain satisfactory perceptual results. Let's go a bit deeper into grain. Grain isn't just overlaid on an image. An image consists of grain. A grain is like a pixel in a digital image, except that form and size varies. One of the key points that follows from this is that the image detail depends on grain size, and visible details do not exceed grain size. Dehancer manages to create a reliable mathematical 3D model that allows to generate flexible, analog-like grain. Unlike overlaying an image of scanned analog grain, it respects the thickness of the film's emulsion and generates grain based on local color and brightness characteristics of the image. This allows the user to dial in the perceived detail, not only overall, but separately in shadows, midtones and highlights. Remember the beginning of this episode where we talked about your image being too sharp? This is the sophisticated method to reduce the perceived resolution to something more cinematic. When you found a look that you love, you can generate LUTs for the color information, not the grain, right in Dehancer. You can use those to monitor during productions. This helps to get the lighting and exposure just right for the look you are trying to achieve in post. Now, Dehancer offers a lot of bang for the buck. Still, it is not what I would call cheap. A lifetime version for 2 seats is $449 US. That is for each host application, apart from Premiere and After Effects that share the same plugin. There are also rental options for 3, 6 and 12 months if you need Dehancer for a limited time. So, can you do film emulation without it? Sure, Resolve has the film look creator that offers a similar set of features, although less sophisticated without specific film stocks, and it also lacks specific camera inputs. A really important benefit of Dehancer is that you are not bound to the Resolve platform. You can use the same plugin and settings across different host applications, which is super important if you don't do your comps in Fusion. Dehancer likes a little spoof, so they sponsored this episode. Thank you so much, Dehancer. I think they deserve some of our love for that. If you want to try Dehancer, there's a free 2-week trial version for download, and if it works for you, we also have the promo code MediaDivision. This will give you 10% off for all Dehancer products, except the iOS app. You will find all the links and the code in the description of this video. Let's get you into film emulation and compositing with our Breaking the Silence tutorial. We are not going to do the intro sequence, which is quite complex as the camera is moving, but this one. And no, the camera is not moving. And we're going to talk about one of the much simpler talkie setups. We're going to use DaVinci Resolve, Adobe After Effects and Photoshop, but of course you can use other apps. If you are familiar with Fusion, you can stay within Resolve, and if you use Premiere, you can stay in the Adobe suite. Both make it easier, I guess. If you're a Lynch or Kubrick member of this channel, you will also get the action pack with the timelines in the After Effects projects to play with. You can find the download links in the community tab of this channel. They will only pop up if you are a member of the respective tier. This will also contain some green screen footage with the Dehancer settings, so if you want to do this yourself, you can simply drop your own green screen footage and maybe something you want to run on the TV to show in the reflection. None of them will contain footage from the original film for copyright reasons. Let's start with the simpler one, the wide-angle talkie setup. We are going to use this original scene from the movie, which has the benefit that you have different lighting situations that you can use for different scenes. You simply take the original scene and reduce grain in Resolve using temporal noise reduction. This works fabulously as the camera is not moving. Now export a frame as a PNG file. Import the frame into Photoshop and use generative fill to edit out Lecter, edit out Starling, and edit in things that she was covering. Again, generative fill helps, but here you have to use some conventional stamping and extensions. You do the same with the air holes, the TV reflection. Export the whole scene without the air holes as a PNG, and air holes, bench, and table as separate PNGs with alpha channel to keep the transparencies. Import all of these into After Effects. Double the backdrop and put it in the front. Mask out the window and the TV set. Make sure that your masks are feathered, fitting the blurriness of the respective object. Now, if you put something in front of the backdrop but behind the rest of the things, it is inside the cell. Here you build a new TV reflection. It is just a comp that is mirrored and contains the distorted video. Mask some holes in it that fit the air holes. Holes are non-reflective. In our action pack comp, you can replace the video by dropping your own in the according comp. Now we shoot what we want to place in the cell. In this case, me. Costume is important here. Refer to the according chapter for information on this one, but you can get creative and do something completely different. When you want to film something to match a backdrop, you should try to match the lighting as good as possible. We see in the original that there's a top light on the right, a soft spot on the left, another top light in the center, and a general soft fill. My living room is a bit small, but we can get away with this setup. There's a narrow LED panel from the top center and from the top right. A small flexible panel light creates the left soft spot, and you see a big diffusion that will give us a bit of fill. These lights will simultaneously illuminate the green screen quite evenly. The green screen itself is just a paper taped to the roof. One of the most important things for a green screen effect to be believable is how to position the camera. It should be in the same angle, height, and distance as the camera on the original. Only these properties influence the perspective, so it doesn't matter what focal length or sensor format you use. Simply choose a focal length that has the same framing, wide enough to allow the desired movement. In our case, and with a full frame camera, that is a Canon FD 55mm lens. The talkies were all shot on the Kinefinity Mavo. As Lecter is very static in his movements, you can simply set the focus and be done with it. Of course, we use log and a 444 color sampling for a good key and hide a tiny laugh mic in the prison jumpsuit to get good audio. To keep the eye line right, we look into the lens when Starling is not in the room. A nice big monitor helps us to see if we are in the right spot from far away. This is the Portkeys MT22DS, a really nice monitor with cool features. It is very recommendable and we are working on a review. Now we just record whatever we want to say. No second operator required. After we are done, we import the footage into After Effects. We apply a Rec 709 LUT so the footage can be keyed better. Then we apply key light, a key cleaner, and a spill suppressor. Now we drop the green screen comp into our cell comp and mask out the remaining stuff, and resize and position it until it fits the cell correctly. Looks okay so far, but as you see, Lecter sticks out as he doesn't have the right colors, and he is way too detailed in relation to the surrounding image. Now let's do some film emulation magic using Dehancer, and we will keep it amazingly simple for this task. Before we apply the Dehancer plugin, I like to put a Gaussian blur and a Lumetri color into the effect stack. If you decrease the resolution in Dehancer, it will not affect the mask of the green screen, but if we use a Gaussian blur, it will blend Lecter into the backdrop, just like mist focus would. We have so much detail to burn that we will reduce detail with Dehancer as well. We set some basic contrast and color balance. You can do this within Dehancer, but I prefer Lumetri here. In the Dehancer plugin, we use the Kodak Vision 250 D stock. D stands for daylight, and our camera was balanced to LEDs with 5600 Kelvin. We set some other factors until it looks just right. You will have all the specific settings in the action packs, including the green screen footage. Now, what is missing here is the grain and the gate weaving that you also see in the original. You can now add an adjustment layer and again use the Dehancer plugin, but disabling the film stock and only have grain and gate weaving enabled. You can look at the original scene to match the grain or do something that looks a little less rough and is more compression friendly. We actually recommend to not do the last step in After Effects, but in your NLE. This allows you to change grain and weaving of all scenes without having to pre-render. This shows you how important the cross-app capabilities of Dehancer are. Dehancer is fast enough in Resolve to display emulation in real time, so it's a very convenient thing to do. Let's go right into a second scene that poses a very different set of challenges and will utilize a different workflow. It is a close-up and we want to do a lot with the face. This is why we will do our grade and emulation in Resolve. This is the original scene that we want to recreate, and as you see, the camera is moving, which makes the whole thing a lot more complex. In the original intro scene, this is a dolly shot, and here you basically have to move the camera to match the change in perspective, which we did with a slider. As you see, we used the Alexa for the main spoof. The movement for the scene we have here is more of a pan and tilt, so we can get away with something much simpler. The camera we shot our green screen footage on is actually static and on a tripod. The trick is to reframe the image to mimic the camera action. We will show you how we did that in a second. We used the same lighting setup as in the intro sequence, but we also put in a card box that will be a stand-in for the cell's window frame, and it will cast a shadow on Lecter, which will look more realistic than to do that in post. If you can go practical, do it. We import the green screen footage in Resolve. I have all the nodes we need already in, and I will show you what each does. To see what you're doing, you can use an overlay of the original scene, but as the lighting changes throughout the scenes, I prefer to see the original clip as a sequence. You can do that by putting it under the footage of the timeline. Now in the Color tab, we add an alpha output to the image, and we also add a second node with a Rec 709 LUT, followed by a node with a 3D keyer. This doesn't have to be great, it is just for the workflow. We will do our key later in After Effects. We also add a node with a mask to get a garbage matte. Now we can not only see the original footage behind our footage, but it will also move along with our footage, and we can see how well our footage is blending into a similar backdrop later. If you reframe fore and background, it helps you to have moving scopes to match your footage too. Super practical. I like to put general grading in front of the Dehancer plugin that is in this node. We again use the Kodak Vision 3 profile. While you can do most of the grading inside Dehancer, we opted to only use it in the stock color emulation in this part of the workflow. Grain is disabled and we will add that in After Effects. We work by setting up Dehancer and then adding nodes around it to get the desired result. Our first node is just balancing and getting the exposure right. The waveform helps a lot. In the next one, we change my eyes to match Lecter's pale dead eyes. We didn't do that in the talkies and it would have just made it so much more complex. We simply draw little polygons around the iris and use softness and curves to lighten the eyes. In the tracking window, we track each iris. Help manual in frame mode when tracker loses the iris on the turn. Leon from Team 2 Films will surely tell me how stupid I do this and show me a way more efficient way. By the way, shout out to Team 2 Films, a great resource here on YouTube, especially for all things Resolve. Check it out. Next node takes care of the prison jumper. Even after 20 washings with bleach, the color is still too vibrant, so we pick a color range and now we can dial down just a tiny bit and we can also push the shadows a little. We already went through the heart of this grade, the film emulation using Dehancer with a Kodak profile. Coming out of Dehancer, we are way too blue in the highlights and we corrected that with a post-emulation node. I came out a little shiny to my taste, so we are using the face refinement effect from Resolve to track my face. And we apply a bit of shine removal. This will make it look like I was wearing a bit of makeup, just like Anthony did in the original. The next and last node takes care of the spill from our green screen. We simply drop greens in our hue and saturation curve. We can now deactivate our alpha output and export our grade with a high color sampling, like ProRes 444. As 10-bit log footage is a bit heavy, I also included a Rec 7 or 9 file for keying in your action pack. Now we switch into After Effects. Yes, Leon, I'm sure you can do this in Fusion, but I can't. Looking at the original scene, it is obvious that we can't remove Anthony for a clean background. So what are we going to do? We simply export an image where the window frame is in focus and an image where the background is in focus. And now we do some Photoshop magic. We extend the bar, which is the easy part, and the background, which is quite painful. You will see that the drawings in the background are not complete in the scene, so we search other scenes where they kind of are and match them to this scene. I will not bore you with the Photoshop process here. In After Effects, we track the foreground. One of the screws in the frame will work fine. We apply the tracking data to a null object. We also track the background. Parts of the wall will work. Again, we apply the tracking data to a null object. We import the foreground, that is just the frame's bar in this case, and position it to match the original. We choose the foreground null as a parent. We also made a file for the glass in the foreground, a bit of dirt and fingerprints. It is just there to sell that Lecter is actually behind glass. We also choose the foreground null as a parent. We import the wall and position it to match the original. We choose the background null as a parent. Now we import Lecter as the green screen version and the graded version and pre-comp them. In the new comp, we apply keylight to the Rec 709 version and mask out the garbage, including the card box. In the graded footage, below the keyed footage, we choose the keyed footage as a track matte. Now we have an excellent key on our grade without having to think about the grade's impact on our green screen. Now we scale and position the comp to match the scene, and we choose the foreground null as a parent. As Lecter is walking to the back, we have to reposition him at the end of the fake camera movement. Set a position keyframe at the start and the end of the camera move and change his position at the end. Ease the movement in and out in the graph editor. That already looks quite good, but what is missing is the depth of field effect we see in the original. This is an easy fix. Just apply the lens blur effect to the background. Put a keyframe at the beginning of the move and set it to 40, and put a keyframe at the end of the move and put that one to 0. We apply the same to the frame bar and the window, but here we keyframe the radius in reverse order. And there you go. As a little extra, we did the reflection in the mirror. We just matched the original reflection in, but it is too boring and complex to show here. One cool thing about having everything done this way is that you can just drop whatever you like into the wall image of the background. Let's say Lecter is a huge fan of the band Kiss. Just drop a poster on the wall and presto. Now Lecter's cell has a lot more rock and roll in it. Again, you can find all the footage, projects, timelines, settings you'll need in the action pack of this episode. Not the copyrighted parts, of course, but you won't need them. To get the action pack, you have to be or become a Lynch or Kubrick member. Rest in peace, Sensei Lynch. The content is the same here, but if you are a Kubrick member, you also get consultation. So if you have questions about this or anything else film related, you can always hook up with us, and we will help you if we can. You will also need Behance if you don't want to try something else yourself. There's a free trial version, and we will put a link to that in the description. If you want to buy Behance, don't forget that we have a 10% off deal with our promo code MEDIADIVISION. Again, you will find that in the description. Have fun with that and create something outstanding. Be sure to do that in a transformative way that honors and elevates the legacy of the original Silence of the Lambs movie. We strongly believe that it's this kind of engagement that keeps a movie alive as a relevant piece of our culture and carries it from one generation to the next. This is what makes a movie a classic. It benefits us as filmmakers, a general audience, the creators of the original, as well as the copyright holders. What's wrong with that? We came full turn and gave you our recipe on how to create films that look cinematic and show a production value that looks way higher than the tiny budget that they actually had. Within this recipe, you can easily dial up and down aspects. Maybe you have access to better cameras and lenses. Maybe you can only use your phone. Maybe you have a little crew and some lights. Maybe you are alone and have to work with available lights. Maybe you have a great set, and maybe you have to look for cool public spaces. Wherever you are on the spectrum and wherever your expertise and budget is, we hope that we were able to encourage you to give it your best and show you that you can do incredible things with very little. The most important ingredient is you. Filmmaking is a journey. When you start out, your results are usually far away from your vision. And then comes a time later on where your results are better than what you imagined. And that is a wonderful feeling worth working towards. Keep your goal in sight, but concentrate on the steps. Just like in a marathon, only this will keep you from losing heart. And if your results aren't what you're hoping for, learn from your mistakes. Life is long and you will get better and better.
With everything we have gone through and explained in this episode, let me take a big step back and qualify some things from a personal standpoint. If you look at cinematography or videography, how it is practiced, especially in lower end films today, don't you have the feeling that most things tend to look the same, follow the same recipe, and often fail to create an interesting vision? It is easy to fall into that trap. Knowing everything about filming, lighting, framing, blocking, and doing all the right things, it often gets you to the same uninspired and boring image. Perfect can be the enemy of good. Looking at scenes of cinematic history that moved me the most, I often see that they are not perfect, and maybe they are not intended to be. Sometimes leaving something away can be very powerful. That is true for any art. To reduce the things until the important parts become visible is a whole school of thought. Artists like Rick Rubin, Alberto Giacometti, and Ridley Scott are guided by that principle. Filmmaking should leave room to be spontaneous, and at least for me, letting go a bit and not overthink or over-planning things created my favorite shots. Still, the image has to serve the story and not the other way around. A good movie is a great story first. And what makes a great story? Once upon a time, there was a witch, and she had a golden lasso that made her immortal. See? A good story is one where you want to know how it ends.
I want to thank the Hanser for their support on making this episode possible. I think they deserve a little love for that, so check them out. Lynch and Kubrick members of the channel can download the action packs that include some footage from our spoofs and project files from Resolve and After Effects, including the notes and effects setting that we used. You can play around with that to your heart's desire. If you just love our content and you would like to support our mission to bring passion and education to the filmmaking community, you can do that by becoming a Scott member. 99 cents per month is probably nothing for you, but if enough of our audience does it, it could make this channel a viable business model, even with the tiny communities that we filmmakers are. Lynch and Kubrick members do more, and they also have access to all action packs of the past. For those who are in the mood for a classic cinecam like an Alexa, we are working on an upcoming standalone episode about what it means to work with it and some DIY tips on how to refurbish Alexa cards to make the whole thing way more budget friendly, and we'll give you all the runtimes and high-speed RAW options that you ever dreamed of. We will include an advanced step-by-step guide with component list for our beloved members, and talking about beloved members. These Kubrick members made this episode possible. A51 Pictures, Adrian Chipur, Ahmad Gul, Andy Lin, Ben Wenho Fan, Ethan Hagel, Eugenio Triana, F0 Camera, First Surname, Fusitio Ion Adrian, Gary Farao, H3FF01, IN53KDO, J. Riley Holt, Jamie Wedo, Jeff Mitchell, Kresimir Kresovic, Malik Skarbor, Marvin Finger, Maximilian Willard, Michael Heidecker, Misha Gerovich, Mott Hupfel, Necron 1050, Nick Martin, Pascal Despois, Peter Pols, Firoz Dalal, Rack Raw, Rob Yale, Robert Hollingworth, Salva Sensano, Scott Hennessy, Sebastian Rooks, Stephen Zett, Zoran James, Srebel, Stefan Sostrom, Steve Welsh, The Black Douglas, Timothy John Agola, Tony Watamena. Thank you so much. You are incredible and the Media Division salutes you. Of course, we love all our other members too. This is for you.
If you like what you saw and got something out of it, please leave us a like. Consider becoming a member of this channel, as that will allow us to create more of the complex content we want to produce for you. This is it for our condensed film school curriculum, and we hope that it will help you to create a cinematic experience yourself. I am your lector, Nicholas, signing out with nerdylicious wishes. Shoot something amazing.